The next section in this presentation is on supervision patterns. It's based on my observation that over the course of different supervisions, I often am involved in the same kinds of work, and sometimes how I express that work, how I express my requirements for students to do particular kinds of work is similar across the supervisions. So let's see if we can formulate this into some kind of method that we can use for different kinds of HDR projects and different kinds of supervisor and different kinds of supervision culture. Supervision patterns are based on this alternative conception of dissertation development, a non-bureaucratic approach to supervision. Basically, the idea is there's more than one way of proceeding through a supervision, and there may be patterns that we can apply to help us get the student through any one point during the supervision. These supervision patterns are going to be the subject of what we talk about in this section. Okay, so a supervision pattern is made by trying to abstract from an actual HDR candidate progress path through their candidature. So what we're trying to do is to see if there's a pattern that we can extract and generalize from an actual supervision or an actual occasion during a supervision where we found that a particular approach was useful. And then to organize this effort into a way where we can actually address a problem. So first thing is, how do we derive these supervision patterns? Second thing is how we apply them. So more than one way of proceeding through an HDR candidature, and some ways are better than others. So supervision patterns should codify that experience. So here are three examples which I've drawn from my own experience, and I'll try and exemplify these, or some of them at least. Once you've developed these supervision patterns, you should be communicating and sharing them with others. So three that I'll concentrate on are a case study back approach, a methods upstream and downstream approach, and a methods first approach. And mostly these are derived from my experience with business students and the fact that they often have very good case studies if they're mature age students and have left the tertiary sector for a while and they're coming back in as a PhD student. They often don't have the kind of background theoretically and methodologically and in terms of the literature that students that are coming into a PhD through another pathway, such as an undergraduate pathway. So let's take the case study back first approach. So this supervision pattern has the general rules start from the case study or case studies, and they're provided by the candidate. Then identify methods that could be used to address the cases, develop a methodological framework, then identify the necessary theoretical approaches that suggest that framework and the research literature. Then we identify what the research problems are that we're addressing. So literally we're working backwards, back up the bureaucratic waterfall from case studies to research problems. So sometimes students that come from industry respond better to this pattern. Another pattern is methods upstream and downstream. So what's going on is we move backward through methods, problems and literature, and then also downward from methods to cases. So we select appropriate methods, we move upstream to understand the research problems, and that can be studied with these methods, and then we look at relevant literature that also talks about them and the research problem, and then restart at the methods and work downstream to the cases. So that's a second supervision pattern. The third supervision pattern we'll look at is methods first. This is also a variation where we start from an important method, identify any supporting methods that may or techniques that are involved in, say, data collection, update a methodological framework, find literature to support methods in that framework or the framework itself, then use literature to modify the methodological framework, and then test the methodological framework in a case study. So this is a methods first supervision. And this is useful when the student has some considerable domain knowledge and has some idea of how they're collecting data, and that collection of data will suggest subsequent methods for its processing, and on you go to the methodological framework. Now, here's an example of this particular practice, this particular supervision pattern. Now, the interesting thing is that what I want to identify here really is that the order in which the student understood the problem is not the order in which you would write up the thesis, so the dissertation. So this particular student was interested in doing what's called place identity study. So it's a kind of marketing study of a particular location, perhaps a city. And this particular student was interested in a particular technique called go-along interviewing, where you would interview somebody who knows about the place, perhaps a tourism expert, perhaps a business person if it's a city, for example, or a historian for a local area. And you conduct a go-along interview with them as you're walking through the place that's of interest to the study. So the student started at the go-along interview method. Then almost immediately you're faced with the situation of how do you collect your data, what's the strategy going to be, and what technologies are you going to use. And the student selected a particular technology, which was a GoPro camera, and they used an action camera, if you like, and then they used a particular kind of transcription standard to help them include elements of the environment that were being referred to by the expert. But the go-along method itself is just one method of data collection. There needed to be a particular framework methodologically constructed. For example, there needed to be a pre-interview prior to the go-along interview. The interviewer and the interviewee needed to meet and decide where they were going to go to plan the actual go-along interview and so on. And then after the go-along interview had been conducted, the student recognised that they needed a sort of follow-up interview to make sure that what they thought had happened during the go-along interview was actually confirmed by the interviewee. So a sort of a subsequent phase. So this became known as a triptych because it's 3 panels, if you like, a pre-interview, a go-along interview, and a post-interview. So this framework of the triptych was developed for this place identity study. Now, the other bit is of this, the other implication of this is that the interviewer and the interviewee should be included as a co-researcher effectively in the conduct of this triptych. So the student then looked to participation theory in order to theorise aspects of the engagement with the interviewee, which they did. Finally, this idea of the data collection strategy, the technologies, the triptych, and the participation elements were then trialled in a pilot study. So as you can see, this particular supervision pattern goes backwards from methodology to theory and then forwards into a pilot study. Now, this is not the order in which you would ever write a thesis. You would write it in the normal way, probably, theory, methods, application, domain. But the reality is the invention of this approach proceeded in a very nonlinear way. So when you are developing a supervision pattern, there are some things that you should consider. There's a handout that's available which provides a kind of a template for creating any supervision pattern. The first thing you should do is name it. The second thing you should do is describe the pattern, your discovery of the pattern, how you came about discovering it or thinking of it as a pattern. Then to write up each of the particular points that are involved in the pattern. A specification of the stages from the previous slide would be an example of completing this part of this supervision patterns handout. Then talk about how you applied that pattern, the application of that pattern. A final section in the handout involves your reflection on whether that pattern was useful or not, your experiences and consequences of using it for the supervision. If you use this particular kind of supervisory pattern, supervision pattern handout, you'll be able to quickly document these patterns as you discover them during the process of supervision. And the act of writing them down enables you to be able to share them with others.